Hi, everyone. This is the lecture on metabolism and nutrition.
So, part one is about nutrients. So, most of the nutrients are used for metabolic fuel. There are a few of them that are used for cell structures and molecular synthesis. A nutrient is defined as something in our food, a substance in our food that's needed for growth, maintenance, and repair. And then there are the main macromolecules that we talked about back in chapter 3. Or is it chapter 2? I think it was chapter 2 in Bio 210, what we call the macronutrients or the macromolecules or the organic molecules. Those are the three big major nutrients that come from our food. That's the carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. What I'm not talking about here is frankenfood. I'm not talking about chemicals. I'm talking about the real, true nutrients that we get from our food. So micronutrients are the other nutrients that are required but only in small amounts. And so there's two of these micronutrients. They are considered vitamins and minerals. Water is also required. It's technically a nutrient, although we don't get any calories off of it. Essential nutrients are those that have to be consumed because we cannot synthesize them from other nutrients. So there are 40 to 50 nutrients, meaning vitamins and minerals and those kinds of things that are considered to be essential. Non-essential are those that are also important for life, but if they're not available, our liver has the ability to convert another nutrient into one. Energy value is measured in kilocalories or kcals. A calorie is the amount of heat that's needed to raise 1 kilogram of water by 1 degree Celsius. And so what we call a calorie is equal to 1 kilocalorie. So the USDA has a MyPlate suggestion, or should they consider them the guidelines as to how we should proportion our macromolecules or our macronutrients. So the food groups that they look at are fruits and vegetables, grains, proteins, and dairy. So basic dietary principle is this: you eat only what you need, and you try to eat plenty of fruits and vegetables and whole grains and stay away from the frankenfood, the junk food, all that stuff that when you look at the label of the ingredients, if there's stuff on there that you can't pronounce, you probably shouldn't be putting it in your body. So there's what it looks like, kind of the idea of the proportions of those. This has changed over the years, and essentially this is what all of those different diets out there are about. They're about manipulating the percentages of these different macromolecules. And here's the bottom line, folks. Anytime you manipulate those percentages and you change them for a while, you are going to lose weight. Eventually, though, your body is a really smart metabolic machine. It is going to figure out the correct way to get what it needs based on what you are getting and still store some as fat. So always remember that. All these diets that come out there, they're making somebody a lot of money, whether it's through books or through food that you can actually buy, all those kinds of things. At the end of the day, it's about somebody making a whole lot of money, and that somebody's not you. You're the one paying it. So use good, sound nutrition and quit trying all the gimmicky stuff because in the end, it never does work. All right, so what is the role of these carbohydrates and lipids and proteins? So this should be something of a review. Parts of this should be review from chapter 2 in Bio 210, and of course some of it should be new. So let's look at carbohydrates first. We're going to talk about the dietary sources of your carbohydrates. These are things that come from plants. So we consider them things like starch. Starch is a complex carbohydrate that's found in grains and vegetables. We also get carbohydrate in the form of sugar, which are considered mono and disaccharides through our fruit and sugarcane, sugar beets, honey, and milk. Even though people say, wait a minute, no, not milk. Milk doesn't have sugar in it. It does. It has a sugar in it. It's not a sweet sugar like you typically think of your other sugars. Insoluble fiber, this is what is in our vegetables. It's basically the cell wall of vegetables. And you and I, we aren't able to digest this. We use it as our roughage in our food. So this is what FiberCon and Fiber One and Metamucil and all those products are about. They basically are adding fiber, insoluble fiber, to our digestive tract, which you saw from the last chapter has got an enormous long length to it. We use that cellulose to attract some water near the end of it if we're dehydrating out too much in the colon, and it allows us to have an easier bowel movement. Soluble fiber is the pectin that you find in apples and citrus fruits, and our body uses that to reduce our cholesterol levels. So that's why it's important to really and truly eat an apple a day. There's a small amount of carbohydrate in milk sugar, as I mentioned, and there's also a small amount of carbohydrate in the glycogen in meats. So what does our body use carbohydrate for? It uses the glucose for fuel. That is the main fuel that our cells use to make ATP. We do have some cells that can use fat for energy. So something that's always important to remember is that neurons and red blood cells are considered to be glucose hogs, if you will. They have to rely on glucose entirely for their metabolic processes. Without glucose, your neurons will not survive. They can't convert anything else. And so one of the functions of that whole idea of the insulin and the glucagon and all of that is to conserve glucose so that you always have it for your brain. Again, it can't operate on any other fuel. Excess glucose is converted to glycogen and stored in the liver and muscles, and any that is beyond that is stored as fat. So here's a great big surprise to a lot of people. What makes most people fat or causes them to gain weight is not fat. It is actually too much carbohydrate, too much glucose. Your body's a really, really smart machine. When you give it extra calories, it's going to store those calories. It's kind of like if you think about calories like money. If somebody gives you extra money, you're not going to just throw it away. You're going to store it away, right? You're going to save it in some way. And that's what your body does. Our bodies still operate as hunter-gatherers. They don't know that we have, at least in the United States, for most of us, an abundance of food, an abundance of calories. So anytime there are extra calories, if it can't be stored as glycogen, if we've saturated our glycogen stores, we are going to store it as fat. So Americans are great carbohydrate eaters. Number one, carbohydrate costs less. But if you consume too much protein, you'll have the same problem. If you consume too much fat, you'll store it as fat. You'll store protein as fat, and you'll store glucose as fat. So at the end of the day, the storage form of your excess calories is fat. Fructose and galactose are converted to glucose by the liver before entering into circulation. What are your dietary requirements of carbohydrate? The recommended daily intake is somewhere between 45 and 65% of your total calories. So most people like to say right at 50%. That kind of makes it easy to count it up. Americans are really, really good, like I said, at getting way too many carbohydrates, and their percentages are way off. And a lot of times, if you just bring those percentages into check, you'll lose weight that way. And that's what those diets are doing a lot of times, is they're bringing these things back into check that you've gotten out of check, and that's why you lose weight. Now, when they get really wacky and say crazy stuff like, you should only be consuming, 10% carbohydrate and the rest is protein and fat, which is a diet that I won't mention, but I can tell you a million reasons why not to go on it. Those particular diets that I'm talking about there, that's when you need to be really careful. But if you just get your percentages of your carbohydrates and your proteins and your fats back in check with the guidelines, I think you'd be surprised, if you're trying to lose weight, how quickly it comes off. So again, 45 to 65%. A lot of people just use the figure 50% to make it easy. So this should consist mostly of complex carbohydrates, whole grains, and vegetables, unless there's some dietary reason why you can't have whole grains or you can't have certain vegetables. And there are people who can't have whole grains and can't have certain vegetables, and you'll learn more about those. But for the most part, we want to use whole grains and vegetables. Simple carbohydrates should be limited. So this is all the white stuff, like white sugar, white flour, white rice, all of those kinds of carbohydrates like that should be limited. High amounts of sugars can lead to obesity as well as nutritional deficiencies. Again, when our body gets excess glucose in the form of sugar and it can't store any more of it as glycogen, it's going to store it as fat. The American diet is roughly 46% carbohydrate. That should include rice, pasta, and breads. Unfortunately, we go way over that. And so that's where the problem is. Why? Because carbohydrates are inexpensive. They're less expensive. And so we see this unique curve in lower socioeconomic status individuals where they buy nothing but carbohydrate because it's cheaper than protein. Protein's expensive. It's the most expensive dietary macromolecule that you'll purchase. So their diet may be 75, 85, 90% carbohydrate, and it is should be no surprise that they start to suffer from obesity really young and end up with type 2 diabetes. So taking a look here at the summaries, we're going to be taking a look at these as summaries of the carbohydrates and lipids and the nutrients. So it's just telling you where you get them from, what percentage of your diet they should include or be all about, and then what happens if you get too much or too little. So now let's take a look at lipids. So just as an aside, when we talk about carbohydrate, for every 1 gram of carbohydrate, you get 4 calories. Let's talk a little bit about lipids now. Where do we get these from? We get triglycerides, which are neutral found fats. These are the most abundant form of lipids that we have, and these are found in saturated fats in meat, so any type of animal protein, dairy foods, tropical oils, meaning coconut oil and palmate oil, or hydrogenated oils, what we call trans fats. And then they also come from unsaturated fats, which are basically found from vegetables. So seeds and nuts and olive oils and most of our vegetable oils that we look at. So basically the difference between those two big worlds, saturated versus unsaturated, is did it come from an animal or did it come from a plant? That's the idea. And of course the unsaturated ones are typically better for our heart and our vessel health, but we do need some saturated fats in our diet for other reasons. Cholesterol comes from egg yolks, meats, organ meat, shellfish, and milk products. Your liver makes cholesterol. You need cholesterol because you need it to be the foundation for um, certain hormones like your steroid hormones like testosterone and estrogen, progesterone, cortisol. All of those are cholesterol based hormones, so you need cholesterol for that. You also need cholesterol to build these things called lipid rafts in the cell membrane that serve as kind of stations for receptors to attach to. So your liver makes a pretty good amount of cholesterol, but we can consume it as well. So for some people, they make too much cholesterol, and that's what drugs like Lipitor and Crestor and all of those are meant for. The liver can convert some fatty acids into others, but the essential fatty acids like the linoleic and the linoleic and the linoleic acids are found in oils. Those have to be consumed. So we do have to consume some level of fat every single day. What does our body use our fats for? Adipose tissue is for protection, insulation, and fuel storage. Nice way of saying this is where I store my excess calories. Phospholipids, which are what make up your cell membrane. So every single cell membrane, you might not have ever thought about this, is basically an oil ring around the contents of that cell, and those are our phospholipids. And so they're super important. If you don't get enough fat in your diet, then your cells can't repair themselves. It's also what makes the myelin sheath for our neurons for nervous transmission. I mentioned this already, but cholesterol stabilizes the membranes. It is the precursor additionally to bile salts and our steroid hormones. We use lipids for prostaglandins, which are necessary for smooth muscle contraction, blood pressure control, and inflammation. Lipids help us to absorb the fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K, and it's a major fuel of our hepatocytes and our skeletal muscle. How much should we get? Well, the American Heart Association says that our fat should make up no more than 30% of our total caloric intake. So we had 50% for our carbohydrate and 30% or less for our fats. Saturated fats should make up less than 10% of your total intake. So your cholesterol should be no more than 300 milligrams a day, which is roughly 1.5 egg yolks. Depends where your eggs are coming from. I think a lot of you know that I raise chickens and farm raised chickens that are raised on whole foods and those kinds of things. Their cholesterol level in their eggs, their yolks is lower, and so uh, those have a little bit different numbers of cholesterol. So what you buy at the store, where the chickens have been basically eating this liquid all of the time, that's high in fats that the chicken doesn't need, makes their cholesterol number go up. The goal is to keep your cholesterol less than 200 milligrams per deciliter. So, looking at our lipids now, again, same kind of a chart telling you where we get them from, how much we should have, what happens if we have too much, and what happens if we don't have enough. So, really good charts for you to review to kind of get an overall of what you, I hope, remember most of from last semester. That leads us to the proteins. The proteins, where do we get this from? Protein typically comes from animal products, so eggs and milk and fish and most meats, as well as some plant material like soybeans. Those are all considered to be complete proteins. And what a complete protein is it is one that contains all of the necessary essential amino acids. Other proteins or sources of proteins like legumes, which are beans, nuts, and cereal contain what are called incomplete proteins. They are missing some of the essential amino acids that we need to build proteins in our body. So if we combine legumes and cereals together, that creates a complete protein. And that's what beans and rice is all about. Every different culture has some variation of that. Vegetarianism, there's certainly nothing wrong with vegetarianism, veganism, all those kinds of things if you know what you're doing. So if you're choosing to go with a plant-based diet, you need to make sure that you educate yourself in making sure that you get complete protein. So why is that important? Complete proteins are essential because your machinery and your cells, that whole transcription, translation stuff that we talk about in first semester of anatomy and physiology is how we build more proteins, and your cells work on an all or nothing principle. If you don't have all the necessary essential amino acids to build proteins, you don't build anything at all. And so that's one of the big drawbacks of a plant-based diet if you do not know what you're doing. If you know what you're doing and you're making sure and you're tracking that and making sure that you get all of the right proteins that you need from your plant-based diet, then it can be very healthy. So here's what I was just talking about. When we're talking about, there are all the essential amino acids listed on the left-hand side. Those are all the ones you have to be able to get. Now, when you're in a plant-based diet, what they're showing you is that corns and grains supply you with two of those, tryptophan and methionine. Your beans and other legumes are going to supply you with isoleucine and lysine. But when you put all of those together, the corn or the grain, rice, it can be rice, whatever grain you're choosing, and your beans or other legumes, it's going to make sure that you have all of the essential amino acids that you need. So that's the idea behind making sure that you are combining your beans and rice correctly. It could be lentils, it could be black beans. There's 1,000 different variations, and like I said, every ethnicity or culture has a version of rice and beans in their diet for this very purpose. What does our body use protein for? Structural materials. I would say building materials, basically. So we build keratin in our skin and collagen and elastin in our connective tissues and muscle proteins. That's a big one right there. We also use proteins for functional molecules like our enzymes and certain hormones. There's 3 factors that help determine whether an amino acid is going to be used to either synthesize a protein, make a protein, or burned as fuel. Again, back to that all or none rule. All of the amino acids have to be present for protein synthesis to occur. If there's missing even one, then that particular amino acid is going to be used for fuel. So it's not going to be used to build something. Well, if you go a long enough period without that one and you need that one, you're not going to be building anything. So you got to make sure you have all of your amino acids. The other thing is the adequacy of your caloric intake. Protein can be used as a fuel if you do not have enough carbohydrate or fat available. But let me tell you, this should always be your last choice. And so this is where I get a little sideways with that keto diet. All right. You should not be burning your proteins as fuel. It is exceptionally hard on your kidneys. It can put you in ketosis and you can die. So please use caution if you are using that particular dietary method. Your body, when it does not have any other calories to burn, it will choose to burn your proteins. So that is what you see when people become what they refer to as skeletal. It's often at the end stage of different diseases like cancer, like HIV/AIDS, where you see somebody go down to just nothing but skin and bones because their body wasn't able to get fuel from any other source for whatever reason, and they had to use their muscle. And that is always, always, always the last choice that you should go for. So why anyone would want to intentionally put themselves in that state, I'm not sure. I do know you lose weight on it, but I also know that it causes a lot of long-term damage that you won't see for about 30 years. So please use caution again in those types of dietary um, processes that some people are using. The other thing about proteins is the hormonal controls. Our anabolic steroids, or anabolic hormones, our growth hormone or sex hormones like testosterone and estrogen, they accelerate protein synthesis and growth, and so we need to make sure that we are consuming more protein when we're going through one of those states, like a growth state. That's what you see when kiddos are going through growth spurts, of course. The adrenocorticotrochoids are the ones that are released during stress. They promote protein breakdown and conversion of the amino acids to glucose so that we can use them for fuel. That's fine if you just have a temporary stressor, but this is what you see when somebody loses a lot of weight after some very stressful event in their life, like the loss of a loved one or the loss of a child, a divorce, or some type of other horrible event that happens in their life, and you notice that they very rapidly drop a lot of weight. Basically what happens is their stress hormones are at a very high level, and it's causing them to break down their proteins faster than they should. Another important thing to know about your proteins is your nitrogen balance. This is the homeostatic state where the rate of protein synthesis equals the rate of breakdown and loss, and we want that. Sometimes you're going to see a positive nitrogen balance. This is when you're making more proteins than you're breaking down, and that's very normal in children because that's what they're doing. They're growing. It's also normal in a pregnant woman because she's growing another person inside of her, and it's normal when you have a lot of tissue repair going on, like perhaps a burn. Negative protein balances happen when you're breaking down more than you synthesize. Again, stress, you see this in burns as well. When somebody just initially has that received that burn, once they start healing, a lot of times you'll see them go into a positive nitrogen balance. Infection, injury, poor dietary proteins, starvation, whether it's self-imposed or because of some other reason. Your dietary requirements are going to reflect, are needed, that you need are going to reflect your age, your size, your metabolic rate, and your nitrogen balance. So the rule of thumb is that your daily intake of about 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. And so you can calculate that out. Some people just use 1 gram as it make it easier and figure out what your body weight is in kilograms, and then that is how many grams of protein you should be consuming a day. The American diet usually provides more than we need. So for a lot of people, they're actually consuming too much protein. So here's the last of those charts. This one is for protein. Where do we get it from? How much should we get? What happens if we have too much? What happens if we have too little? And what I want you to notice on every one of these, when you have too much, the excesses, first thing is obesity, because it goes right back to what I said before. Whenever you have an excess of calories, regardless of the source of those calories, your body stores it as fat. What about vitamins? So these are organic compounds that are crucial for helping our body use nutrients. And so that is a key word, helping. Most of them function as coenzymes. Most must be ingested. However, vitamin D is made through the skin, or at least the process is started at the skin. There are some B vitamins and K vitamins that are synthesized by the bacteria that are living in your gut. And then beta carotene, which is, for example, that comes from carrots, anything orange or red or yellow. It's converted in the body to vitamin A. There is no one food group that contains all of the vitamins, which goes back to the whole idea that you got to eat a balanced diet. So two types of vitamins that are based on their solubility. The water-soluble vitamins, these are the B complex and the C's. They are absorbed along with water. B12 absorption requires intrinsic factor from the body of the stomach. These are not stored in the body. So anything that's not used within an hour is excreted in the urine. So taking excesses of these particular vitamins isn't necessarily harmful. You're just making really expensive pee when you do that. Fat-soluble vitamins, a little bit different story with our fat-soluble vitamins. This is going to be A, D, E, and K, ADEC. These are absorbed with lipid digestion products, so you've got to have some fat to absorb these. These are stored in our bodies with the exception of vitamin K. If we consume too many of these, it can cause health problems. So you have to be careful about vitamins. So vitamins are not meant to be taken alone. Vitamins help your body use the food that you eat better. All right, so I'm assuming you're eating a balanced diet that has a lot of natural foods in it, so you're not eating a lot of junk food. Your body is using those nutrients, and vitamins help you do that better. That's why they're called cofactors or coenzymes. Merely taking a handful of vitamins in lieu of eating is just a silly thing to do because it's not helping anything. But the fat solubles you have to be careful of because you can store those in your body. So that's one of the cautions you have to take with the vitamins that look like candy and taste like candy for kids, like the gummy vitamins. They can actually overdose on those. So you want to make sure if you're using those in your house, or your Fred Flintstone vitamins, or whatever it is that you're using in your house, you got kiddos around, that you really and truly keep those, like any other medicine, away from kids. Consuming excesses of those can be dangerous. So, some more things about vitamins. Dangerous free radicals are generated during normal metabolism. So, if you remember free radicals, they're basically an atom that does not have the right number of electrons. So, rather than doing the right thing and borrowing or sharing or exchanging, they just go out and steal electrons from other atoms. And when they do that, it's called a free radical and it creates a chain reaction. Well, these are a normal byproduct of our metabolisms. So vitamin C, vitamin E, and vitamin A, and the mineral selenium are antioxidants. They basically neutralize these free radicals. So where do you find these? Probably in things you don't like to eat very much, but the cruciferous vegetables like broccoli and cauliflower and Brussels sprouts are a really great source of vitamin A and vitamin C. Megadoses of vitamins, as I mentioned, are useless, and they may actually cause serious health problems depending on which vitamin you overindulged in. So here's all the vitamins. By no means do you need to know what each and every one of these do, but they are, this is a good chart to refer to so that you understand where we get them from, what they do for us in our body, and what happens if you have not enough or too much. Again, always good to look at. And then the fat-soluble vitamins on the second page. 7 minerals are required in moderate amounts. Those include calcium, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, sodium, chlorine, and magnesium. Others are required in what they refer to as trace amounts or tiny amounts. Again, these work with the nutrients that you consume to ensure that your body is functioning properly. And if you take too many, you want to make sure that the uptake and excretion are balanced to prevent a toxic overload. So if you take too many, you're not able to get rid of some of those, the ADEC vitamins, the fat-soluble vitamins, and you can end up with them building up in your fat tissues. Some examples of what they do for your body, the minerals. Calcium, phosphorus, magnesium salts are what help to harden your bone. Iron is required to bind oxygen by hemoglobin in our circulatory system. Iodine is necessary to make those thyroid hormones, T3 and T4 that we talked about. Sodium and chloride are major electrolytes, which help keep our electrolyte balance correct in our body. Mineral-rich foods, vegetables, legumes, milk, and some meat. So here is some stuff about the minerals in your body. So what all of the ones that you need in a certain amount, again, where you get them from, what they do in your body, and what happens when you don't have them. Here are the trace minerals. Again, you don't have to learn every detail of these. I would make sure that I know which ones are the ones you absolutely have to have, and then the traces, make sure you know which ones are traces, trace minerals. But as far as all of the details here, this is a chart you can always look up. So part 2 of this is about metabolism. So we need to redefine metabolism in our mind for our biology understanding. So in the regular world, in the everyday world, metabolism typically means how many calories are you burning. But in a biological sense, metabolism has a slightly different definition. And so it is the sum of all biochemical reactions inside of a cell that involves nutrients. So it's not just how fast you burn calories, but it's also, which is catabolism, it's also the anabolism is how fast are we building things up. So anabolism and catabolism. Anabolism means to synthesize or to make large molecules from smaller ones. So I always use the example of Legos. You put individual Legos together and you make something bigger. And that's anabolism. A good example of this would be proteins. Proteins are made from the building blocks amino acids. So we put amino acids together with a peptide bond and we create a protein. Catabolism is just the opposite. Now let's take our little whatever we made with our Lego apart, and the individual Legos is what we end up with. So this is the hydrolysis of complex structures to simpler ones. So if we take that same protein that we put together with amino acids and break it down, we go back to amino acids. Cellular respiration is the catabolic breakdown of the fuel from our food so that the energy from that food can be captured to form ATP in our cells. So as a reminder from last semester, ATP, remember what ATP was. ATP is the energy exchange or the energy currency that our body uses. It's the storage molecule that is able to hold energy, because energy can't just float around freely in our body. So it's stored in the bonds of the ATP molecule. So cellular respiration is how we store that energy into those bonds from the food that we consume. So the goal of cellular respiration is to trap the chemical energy in the ATP, which is our molecule that we store it in. Energy can also be stored in glycogen and fats, which can be broken down later. Phosphorylation is when the enzymes shift the high energy phosphate groups of the ATP molecule to other molecules. So phosphorylated molecules now have been energized, or they can become activated, and they can start to perform cellular function. So that's all phosphorylation is just snapping off that last phosphate off of the ATP molecule and taking that energy and transferring it over to another molecule that allows it to do work. We saw this in the sliding filament theory of muscle contraction when the myosin head, it became phosphorylated when an ATP molecule was used or broken so that it could make that bond with the actin filament. There's 3 stages in processing our nutrients. Stage 1 is digestion, absorption, and transport to the tissues. So that's kind of what we were looking at in the last chapter. Stage 2 is the cellular processing, which happens in the cytoplasm. This is the synthesis of the lipids, proteins, and glycogen, or the catabolism called glycolysis of the glucose molecule into pyruvic acid and acetylcholine A. Then stage 3, which is the oxidative breakdown of the intermediates into carbon dioxide, water, and ATP, and this is what occurs in the mitochondria. Cellular respiration consists of glycolysis of stage 2 and all of stage 3. So this is kind of the idea of those 3 stages I was just talking about. Stage 1 was all the stuff we just talked about last chapter with the digestive tract, how our body takes in the proteins, carbohydrates, and fats and breaks those down into the individual building blocks that are small enough to move over the digestive lining. That's stage 1. Stage 2 now is what happens. What's the fate of those individual macromolecule building blocks as they go into the cells and the tissues. And so it's going to tell you all about, we're going to talk all about the process of glycolysis. And then stage 3 is what happens when the products that we get from glycolysis enter into the citric acid cycle in the mitochondria and ultimately into oxidative phosphorylation in the electron transport chain. And we are able to get energy or ATP out of our food molecules. So this is what happens in the mitochondria. So oxidative reduction reactions and the role of the coenzymes. So oxidative reactions, these involve the gain of an oxygen or the loss of a hydrogen atom, as well as their electrons. So oxidative reduction reactions or redox reactions are the events that happen is that you have oxidized substances that lose electrons and energy and reduced substances that gain electrons and energy. Redox reactions are catalyzed by enzymes, and they usually require a B vitamin coenzyme. Dehydrogenases catalyze the removal of the hydrogen ion, and oxidases catalyze the transfer of the oxygen. There's 2 important coenzymes that act as hydrogen or electron acceptors in the oxidative pathways. One of them is nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, or NAD, and the other one is flavin adenine dinucleotide, or FAD. So ATP synthesis. Two mechanisms are used to make ATP from energy that's been captured and that is liberated during cellular respiration, in other words, from bond breaking. So remember, when we break a bond, we liberate energy. The first one is called substrate level phosphorylation. This is when the high energy phosphate group is transferred directly from the phosphorylated substances to an ADP molecule. This occurs twice in glycolysis and once in the Krebs cycle. The necessary enzymes are in the cytosol for glycolysis and in the mitochondria for Krebs cycle. So basically, here's what happens. They have a high energy phosphate group that's transferred directly from a substrate to ADP, and it causes it to form ATP. This happens in the cytosol and the mitochondrial matrix. The other one that's way more complicated is called oxidative phosphorylation, but we get a whole lot more ATP out of this. So the chemoosmotic process is going to couple the movement of substances across the membrane to chemical reactions. Energy is going to be released from the oxidation of your food that is going to be used to pump hydrogen ion across the inner mitochondrial membrane, creates a steep hydrogen ion concentration gradient, and as the hydrogen ion flows back through the ATP synthase membrane channel protein, energy from that flow is used to phosphorylate an ADP molecule back into an ATP molecule. And so that's what they're showing you there. Again, don't get yourself too bent up in the details of that, but get the idea that there's two different ways and what those are called. So what about carbohydrate metabolism? So when glucose enters a cell, it becomes phosphorylated to create a molecule, glucose 6-phosphate. Most cells lack the enzymes for the reverse reaction, so glucose now becomes trapped inside of the cell. The only cells that are able to do this reverse are the intestinal cells, the kidney cells, and the liver cells. They actually can release glucose. This keeps the intracellular glucose concentration low, which ensures the continuity of glucose entry because it's going from an area of high to an area of low. Glucose is catabolized via the following reaction. So here is one of the few places that I make you really and truly you do have to know a reaction. So let's talk about this reaction. So you got to memorize this. So glucose molecule is C6H12O6 plus 6 oxygens are going to produce 6 hydrogen or 6 oxygen, or that should be water, sorry, 6 waters H2O plus 6 carbon dioxides plus 32 ATP plus heat. So basically what they're saying is that from every glucose molecule, we get approximately 32 ATP molecules and heat, as well as some water and some carbon dioxide. That's where the carbon dioxide comes from that you breathe out. So every time you breathe out, that carbon dioxide, where did it come from? It came from this reaction right here that your cells are actively engaged in, even as we speak. Complete glucose catabolism, or the breakdown of a glucose molecule, requires 3 pathways. The first one's called glycolysis. The second is called Krebs cycle. Some books call it the citric acid cycle. When we get into microbiology, we call it the tricarboxylic acid cycle or the TCA cycle. They all mean the same thing. All right, so some people call it the Krebs citric acid cycle. So lots of ways to term that. It's the step in the middle. And then the electron transport chain and oxidative phosphorylation. So here's the big idea. And so I encourage you to look at this first and then come back and look at this afterwards. But this is the big picture of what you need to know. The first step is called glycolysis. It occurs in the cytosol of the cell, not in the mitochondria. And the name tells you what it does. Glucolysis. It breaks that glucose or cleaves a glucose C6H12O6 molecule into 2 molecules of pyruvic acid. You get 2 ATP molecules off of that. You actually get 4 ATP molecules, but you have to pay back 2. Then the product, the pyruvic acid, you see that? See the arrow? It goes into the mitochondria. So now we move the order of operations to the inside of the mitochondria, and specifically we move it to the matrix or the gel inside of the mitochondria. There's going to be a whole bunch of events that happen, and we're going to get some more ATP, 2 ATP off of that. Then the products of that, you see the arrow coming off, the energy coming off of that is going to move the order of operations over to the Christie or the squiggly line of the mitochondria and enter into the electron transport chain and oxidative phosphorylation. And now we're going to get the biggest bang for our buck. This is where we're going to get the most ATP molecules. Okay? So let's talk about those. Glycolysis, also called the glycolytic pathway, it involves 10 different steps that we, hallelujah, do not have to know most of. It is considered anaerobic, means that it happens whether there is oxygen or not. It occurs, again, in the cytosol of the cell. So this is inside of the cell, not in the extracellular fluid, but it is inside of the cell, and our glucose molecule is broken into two 3-carbon sugars called pyruvic acid, because remember, we started out as a 6-carbon sugar. All together, we make 4 ATP, but we have to pay 2 ATP back to get the that we borrowed to get the reaction going. Remember, every reaction requires a certain amount of energy being put into the system, and in this case, it was 2 ATP, so we have to pay those back. So what we end up with, the final products of glycolysis, are 2 pyruvic acids. Those are our C3H4O3s. That's 2 from the cleaving of our glucose molecule, 2 reduced NADs, and a net gain of 2 ATP. Notice that I have net in red. Net means how many do I get to use. It's kind of like your paycheck. Your paycheck has the gross amount, and then it has the net amount. The net amount is the amount that you actually get. So we get 2 net ATP off of glycolysis. For glycolysis to continue, more NAD must be present to accept more hydrogen ions or atoms. The supply of NAD is limited. NADH must donate its accepted hydrogen atoms to become NAD cation, again, to be free to pick up more hydrogen. So basically what NAD is it is a hydrogen ion or a proton, if you want to think of it that way, an electron shuffling taxi cab. It's moving hydrogen ions around. If oxygen is present, the NADH will transfer its hydrogen to proteins in the electron transport chain, and this is going to occur in the mitochondria. If no oxygen is present, NADH will give hydrogens back to pyruvic acid and reduce it to lactic acid. What's the fate of that lactic acid? Some of it may leave the cell and be picked up by your liver, where it can be converted back into glucose 6-phosphate. Some may be oxidized back to pyruvic acid when the oxygen becomes available, and then it can enter into the aerobic pathways. Prolonged anaerobic metabolism can lead to acid-base problems, and glycolysis results in a faster production of ATP than it does through aerobic respiration, but we get way less. We only get 2 net ATP. So here's the idea. Let's just pretend that you go to the gym this afternoon and you hop up on the treadmill and you're moving along, and you haven't done this in a really long time, so you're not getting as much oxygen to your cells now as the exercise continues. You don't fall off the treadmill because you don't have enough oxygen going to your cells. Your cells will continue to operate, your muscle cells will continue to operate, but they will have to stay in glycolysis. They can't go through the entire process of cellular respiration and get all of those extra ATP molecules. They can only do the glycolysis part because you aren't respiring correctly and getting enough oxygen to your tissues for this to continue. So it will continue to operate, but it's going to build up this lactic acid, and that lactic acid is what you feel the next day when your muscles are sore. Then we enter into the citric acid cycle, also known as the Krebs cycle. This is where we moved our whole reaction to the mitochondrial matrix. This is fueled by the pyruvic acid from the glucose breakdown. Also, fatty acids can enter from fat breakdown at this particular point. The pyruvic acid must be actively transported into the mitochondria because it is a charged molecule. And once inside the mitochondria, the pyruvic acid is going to enter into the transitional phase. The transitional phase is when the pyruvic acid it's like a little half step. The pyruvic acid is converted to acetyl coenzyme A, what we call acetyl-CoA. So when you first see this, don't give yourself a heart attack here. We don't have to learn all of the intermediate steps here. All right, so what I want you to see is the blue band at the top that's light blue, and that's representing the cytosol. And that's where we broke that glucose into the pyruvic acid. All right, and that was our 2,3 carbon fragments that we had. Then we moved into, there was that little transitional phase that happens right when we move into the matrix, where we take that pyruvic acid and we make it into acetyl-CoA. And notice that you got arrows that are spinning off, and it's showing you what products are being made here. Okay? Then we take that acetyl-CoA, and here's where you do not have to memorize all of this. Please, please, please don't do this unless you're going into biochemistry or pharmacy or something like that. You do not have to know all of these intimate details. But what I do want you to get from this is notice that every single time we go to a next step, follow those arrows, the molecule changes. It changes, it spins off some products in that process, and it changes names. All right. And so as it goes around, you can see that there's products being spun off. Okay, that's the idea of what's happening in the second phase here. This is where we get some ATP, but this is also where we get some carbon dioxide. Again, where are you getting that carbon dioxide from that you're breathing it out? This process right here. So the oxidation of that glucose, the coenzyme A then shuffles its acetic acid to an enzyme in the citric acid, and it joins blah, blah, blah. And so it tells you that it joins to a 4-carbon oxaloacetic acid, these are hard to say, which again produces another 6-carbon acid called citric acid, and that's where this name comes from. There are 8 steps. We don't care what they are. They involve that original acetic acid. It has a whole bunch of modifications that are made to it, and it results in products being spun off, including NADH, hydrogen ion, FADH2, and carbon dioxide. The NADH and the FADH2 are electron taxi cabs. They're going to shuffle electrons over to the next stage. In the final step, the oxaloacetic acid is regenerated and goes around a second time. For each turn of the cycle, we get 2 carbon dioxides, we get 4 molecules of the reduced enzymes, and we get 1 ATP. We started with 2 pyruvic acid molecules, so the amount of the final products from 1 glucose is doubled because we have to go through that whole process 2 times. Adding products of the transitional phase, the final total breakdown products for 1 glucose at this point are 6 carbon dioxides that you're going to exhale, 8 NADHs plus hydrogen ion plus 2 FADH2s and 2 ATP molecules. So the moral of the story is we get 2 ATP molecules plus some other stuff off of here. So there's that picture again. Again, do not need to learn all of these intimate details. The NADH must be oxidized to ensure that there is plenty NADH ions, so glycolysis, transitional phase, and citric acid cycle can continue. The NADH will be oxidized in the electron transport chain. The breakdown products of fat. So this was what do we do if we have glucose, but what if we are breaking down fat or proteins instead? They enter in during the citric acid cycle. They don't go through glycolysis because they're not glucose, but they enter at this particular point and they can be broken down and used. There are some cell intermediates that can be used as building materials for anabolic reactions rather than just catabolic reactions at this point too. So that moves us over to the electron transport chain and oxidative phosphorylation. This actually consists of 2 phases. So phase 1 is electron transport chain that creates a proton gradient across the mitochondrial membrane using high energy electrons that were removed from the hydrogen from our food. Stage 2 is called, or phase 2 is called chemoosmosis, that uses the energy of the proton gradient to synthesize more ATP. So just a picture of what this purportedly looks like on our cell membrane. So we're looking at this process has actually moved to the squiggly line, the membrane that is in the middle of our mitochondria. So the squiggly line going down the middle of the mitochondria is called the cristae, and that's what they're showing you here. That's why it looks like a membrane, because it is a membrane, but it's not a cell membrane, it's a mitochondrial membrane. And there is a proposed picture of the process of things moving down the electron transport chain, and as they move down this series of metal ions, ATP is released. So the story of the ATP, the electron transport chain, is this where we get our biggest bang for the buck. We end up getting 28 ATP off of there. So we want to get all the way to electron transport chain in cellular respiration, because this is how we're going to end up getting the most ATP out of the entire process. If we don't get that far, then obviously we miss out on all those ATP molecules. Cyanide, which is the gas that they use in gas chambers, what it does is disrupt oxidative phosphorylation. That's how it works. Poisons that are called uncouplers, and cyanide is an example of an uncouplers. They abolish the proton gradient by making the inner mitochondrial membrane permeable to hydrogen ion. And so although the electron transport chain continues to deliver electrons to the oxygen ultimately at a furious rate, the oxygen consumption rises and no ATP is made. And so that's how cyanide gas does its dirty deed. So here's the important thing. I mean, I want you to understand those other details, but here is what you want to make sure that you know about the summary of your ATP production. Energy use at rest, in other words, when you're just sitting there, averages approximately 100 kilocalories per hour. That's equivalent to 116 watts, which is basically a 100-watt light bulb. So you just sitting there, just gelling, fuzzing out, doing nothing, uses about 100 calories an hour. All right. So if you're sitting there eating a bag of M&Ms, realizing you're adding a whole lot of extra calories than what you need. The 100 calories an hour, places a huge demand on your mitochondria to make energy. Of the 686 kilocalories from 1 mole of glucose, approximately 262 of those are captured in the form of ATP. The rest of it we lose to heat. And so basically what that says is that your efficiency rate for using your fuel is about 38%. Machines, let's just say your wash machine, it has an efficiency between 10 and 30%. So you and I are more efficient than a man-made machine, but not much. So your net energy gain, again, summary stuff that you want to know from the complete oxidation, and here's the key word, complete oxidation of 1C6H12O6 or glucose molecule. Your substrate level phosphorylation, we get 4 ATPs out of that. We get 2 from glycolysis and 2 from citric acid. If we go through the oxidative phosphorylation, that makes our 28 ATP that I was talking about. All right, so that's an important idea. They give you some of the breakdowns. My message to you about this whole thing of how many ATPs do you get through or from each glucose molecule is every textbook is going to tell you something different. The parts that we know for sure is what happens in glycolysis and citric acid, the substrate level phosphorylation. We know that we get 4 ATP out of that. The rest of it, it's real sketchy. Every book will tell you something different. So what I want you to know is that we get somewhere in the 30s for every complete oxidation of a glucose molecule. I say 30-ish. Some books will tell you 30, some will tell you 32, 34, 36, and 38. It just depends on the research that that particular author has engaged in. So don't get too hung up on that. Just know that it's a number in the 30s. But the part that we do know for sure is the 2 from glycolysis and the 2 from citric acid. So here's where they're talking about that. The total between the substrate level phosphorylation and oxidative phosphorylation equals roughly 32 ATP, but energy is required to move the NADH plus the hydrogen ion that's generated in glycolysis into the mitochondria, which uses up roughly 2 ATP. So a final total of 30 ATP is what your author is using, but there's uncertainty of that. My microbiology book that was just published is using 36. So again, don't get too hung up on what's the total number. It's somewhere in the 30s. So anytime you're answering a multiple choice question, there should only be one number. How many ATP molecules are generated from the full oxidation of one glucose molecule? There should be a number, only one choice in the 30s. Everything else is going to be like 2 and 4 and 100 or something like that. So here is that picture with some augmented done to it. So they're showing you, again, how many ATP, where it is occurring, and the name of the step. And that is what I want you to know. What's the name of the step? Basically, what's the big idea about that step? What are the products that are formed? How many ATP? Are we getting carbon dioxide? And where does it happen? All right, so glycolysis is the breakdown of a glucose into pyruvic acid. We make 4 ATP. We can only use 2 of them because we have to pay back 2 for activation energy. So this process happens in the cytosol of the cell, and we get 2 ATP molecules to use from this. Then we move into the mitochondria. We have a little half step that happens where we convert the pyruvic acid into acetylcholine A. We are now in the matrix of the mitochondria, and citric acid cycle happens. We're going to get 2 more ATP out of this particular cycle. Then we take the products of the citric acid cycle, the 6-NAD and the hydrogen ion, and the FAD2s, and we move those over to the electron transport chain and oxidative phosphorylation that occurs on the mitochondrial membrane, the cristae, and it is here that we're going to get the biggest bang for our buck. So it's going to be here that we're going to get roughly 28 ATP molecules. When we add all that together, we get somewhere in the 30s, a 30-ish number for the complete combustion or catabolism of one glucose molecule. Here's the other part to that. It's never a perfect system. All right, so this is performed in a vacuum in a perfect system. It's never perfect. So just go with a 30-something number and you'll be good to go. So leave that behind for a little bit. Let's talk about some other terminology. Glycogenesis, glycogenolysis, and gluconeogenesis. Some big funny words that we're going to break apart and learn. So cells, as we already know, cannot store large amounts of ATP. Rising intracellular levels of ATP inhibit glucose catabolism and promote the formation of glycogen, which is the storage form of glucose in our liver cells and our fat, or if we have too much, our friend fat formation. So glycogenesis, so glyco means glycogen, genesis means the beginning or the formation of. This is converting your excess glucose into the storage form of glycogen, which occurs in our liver and skeletal muscle cells. Glycogenolysis is the breakdown of that glycogen that we stored via glycogen phosphorylase, which is the enzyme that breaks it down whenever we don't have enough glucose in our blood. So when we don't have enough sugar in our blood, we break down our storage form of glucose from our liver and our muscle cells. So the liver cells, as well as some of your kidney and intestinal cells, also contain an enzyme that removes the terminal phosphate, which produces free glucose. Now that glucose is free to enter into the bloodstream to be used by the cells as fuel. So they're showing you that whole process of glucogenesis and glycogenesis and glycogenolysis in response to our blood sugar number. So this is what's happening all the time with the help of insulin, obviously, and glucagon. All right, then there's the term gluconeogenesis. Let's look at that. So gluco meaning glucose, neo meaning new, genesis meaning the formation of. This is the actual formation of glucose from a non-carbohydrate source. So we have the ability to do this as well. Typically happens in your liver. So we can make glucose from glycerol and amino acids when your blood glucose level drops. And what this does is help protect against the damaging effects of low blood glucose or hypoglycemia. This again is really important for that nervous system because remember, the brain is a glucose hog. It can only operate on glucose. So we have the ability to make new glucose out of a non-glucose product if necessary. So there's your 4 terms that you want to make sure that you know. What about lipid metabolism? Lipids provide the bigger bang for the buck. So I meant to tell you this earlier. I said that you get 4 calories from 1 gram of carbohydrate. You also get 4 calories from 1 gram of protein, but you get 9 calories from 1 gram of lipids. So your biggest bang for your buck as far as getting calories is going to be from your fats that you consume. That's why 1 gram of something that's all fat, like cheesecake, takes up a whole lot less space on the scale than 1 gram of broccoli. And you get twice the amount of calories for that 1 gram of cheesecake. But it's not nearly as much fun to eat the broccoli, is it? But nonetheless. All right, so lipids provide the greater energy yield from either the glucose or protein catabolism. Again, 9 kilocalories per gram versus 4 from the other 2. So you get twice as many calories from the same amount of fat. Most products of fat digestion are transported in the lymph. You learned about that in the last chapter. Remember that fat, it is not transported the same way. It's not using that hepatic portal system. It's not going over to the liver. Instead, it's being directly deposited into our blood via our lymph as chyromicrons. So it's hydrolyzed by the endothelial enzymes into fatty acids and glycerols. Only triglyceride can be routinely oxidized for energy. So that's the only one that we can break apart and use for energy. The two building blocks of our triglycerides, if you remember, were glycerol and fatty acid. How do we break the glycerol down? It's broken down. Then it can enter into the citric acid cycle directly. The ATP yield for this is roughly half of a glucose molecule because the glyceraldehyde is only half of a glucose. So basically for every glycerol molecule that we break down, we're going to get about 15 ATP. We can also break down the fatty acid component of that macromolecule, and that undergoes beta oxidation in the mitochondria. So it's showing you here the big picture idea is that if we're going to choose to break down fats, if our body's breaking down fats, which some of us want that to actually happen, then it doesn't go into the whole cellular respiration process at glycolysis. It skips that. There's some modifications that have to be made to those precursor products, and then they enter directly into the citric acid cycle and go through the whole process. Lipogenesis, so the word should tell you fat formation. This is triglyceride synthesis that occurs when the cellular ATP and glucose levels are high. So this is where I was talking about right here. See the magic word there. Glucose levels are high, so we make fat out of that. Dietary glycerol and fatty acids that are not needed as energy are stored as triglycerides. Back to what I've been saying all along. 50% will be stored in your adipose tissue as adipocytes. The other 50% is going to be deposited in other areas of your body, like between your organs or other places like that. Glucose is easily converted to fat because the acetyl-CoA is an intermediate in glucose catabolism, and it is the starting point for fatty acid synthesis. So it's really easy for our body to take that excess glucose and make it right into fat so we can store it for later. Lipolysis is the breakdown of the stored fats into glycerol and fatty acids, which is, of course, the reverse of lipogenesis. Fatty acids are actually the preferred fuel of the liver, the cardiac muscle, and resting skeletal muscle. Lipolysis is accelerated when carbohydrate intake is inadequate. In other words, when you dampen down the amount of carbohydrate that you're consuming, you're forcing your body to burn its fat as fuel. And that's what it's showing you right there. Again, don't get yourself all caught up in all the details here. It's just showing you the steps and where they enter into this. So our body is real easy. It's easy for us to convert back and forth between fat and glucose. That's why, if you remember from Chapter 2 in Bio 210, that the function of carbohydrate is energy. The function of your fats is energy storage. So it's how we store our excess energy, our fuel that we're going to need for energy. So there's some just terminology again for you to look at. Accumulation of ketone bodies in the blood can lead to ketosis. This is common in starvation. Unwise dieting, which is what the keto diet is all about. Don't get me on that soapbox again. Or diabetes mellitus. Ketone bodies are also excreted in your urine, which tells you that they have to run through your kidneys, which is why you end up with kidney damage from that particular diet. Ketones are acidic, so a buildup of these molecules can lead to metabolic acidosis, which, as we all know, can kill you in a matter of a few days, which can cause dangerously low pH levels. When this happens, the patient's breath will often smell fruity or almost like they have been drinking. So this can be a sign that they have unchecked diabetes. So if your patient smells like alcohol and you know that they have not been drinking, they probably have unchecked diabetes. But this is the state people put themselves into in the keto diet. Also, the breathing can become rapid as the lungs try to release the excess carbon dioxide to raise that pH. They try to literally blow off the carbon dioxide. So, what is the synthesis of our structural materials? Lipids play a lot of roles in building stuff in our body. The phospholipids that I mentioned earlier, these are the cell membranes. That's what's separating the cell membrane, is what's separating the outside world and the inside world. And basically, it's a ring of fat. And since most of your body is water, that's what keeps the two water compartments separated from each other. Cholesterol is used in your cell membranes. It's also used, again, to make some of your different steroid hormones. In addition, the liver is going to synthesize transport lipoproteins for cholesterol and fats. It synthesizes cholesterol from acetyl-CoA, and it uses cholesterol to form bile salts to make bile.
All right. That's the ending of this particular recording. I hope you'll join me for the next one.